Appendix 2, HSCA Procedural Write-Up, Mexico Trip. House Select Committee on Assassinations staffers Gary Cornwell, Dan Hardway, Edwin Lopez, and Harold Leap arrived in Mexico City Airport at 8:30 p.m., May 30th, 1978. All times are Mexico City times, unless otherwise specified. They were met and escorted through customs by David Patton, an employee of the United States Embassy. The following morning, May 31st, 1978, the HSCA representatives met with U.S. Embassy political officer Richard Howard concerning procedure. Mr. Howard scheduled a meeting at 11:15 a.m. with the chief of the CIA station in Mexico City. This meeting was preliminary in nature and concerned procedures regarding arrangement of the interviews of ex-CIA employees in Mexico. At 12 noon, the HSCA representatives and Richard Howard met representatives of the government of Mexico. The Mexican representatives were 1. Dr. Jesus Yanez, advisor to the Attorney General's executive officer; 2. Fernando Baeza, chief administrative officer for the Attorney General; and 3. Comandante Florentino Ventura, chief of the Mexican Federal Police. The Mexicans informed the staff members at this meeting that they had located Sylvia Duran, Horacio Duran, Ruben Duran, and Pedro Gutierrez Valencia, and that each person was willing to be interviewed by the HSCA representatives. Footnote: Pedro Gutierrez Valencia claimed that he bumped into Lee Harvey Oswald at the consulate on September 27, 1963. Valencia was at the consulate doing a credit check on one of the Cuban employees. End footnote. Procedure for conduct of the interviews was also discussed at this meeting. The Mexican government decided that the initial interview would be an informal contact with the witnesses in which the committee's objectives would be described. The witnesses' statements would be formalized at a later taped interview. The Mexican officials informed the HSCA staff members that they had been unable to locate Oscar Contreras, Elena Garro de Paz, and Elenita Garro de Paz. The Mexican government had not had contact with the Garros since 1968. The Mexicans said that they were trying to locate the Garros through the foreign ministry since Elena's ex-husband, Octavio Paz, had once been an important person in that ministry. The Mexicans asked that we determine the name of the Mexican government contact during 1964 with the Warren Commission so that they could locate their records in the archives. The Mexican officials left to set up the preliminary interviews with witnesses. The preliminary interviews were conducted by Gary Cornwell. HSCA staff members Dan Hardway, Edwin Lopez, and Harold Leap were present during Cornwell's questioning. The Mexican government was represented by Dr. Jesus Yanez, Comandante Florentino Ventura, and Jesus Majuro Cante, second in command to Ventura. Pedro Gutierrez Valencia was interviewed at 2:30 p.m. Ruben Duran was interviewed at 5 p.m. Horacio Duran was interviewed at 5:30 p.m. Sylvia Duran was interviewed at 6:15 p.m. At 9:30 a.m. on June 1st, 1978, the HSCA staff representatives met with the Mexican police representatives. The HSCA staff requested 1. The records of the company that employed Gutierrez Valencia in 1963, press clippings of the Mexican newspaper coverage of Oswald and Sylvia Duran, attached. 3. Once again, an interview with Oscar Contreras. 4. Individual files on Elena Garro de Paz and Sylvia Duran. 5. Evidence related to Sylvia Duran's assertion that Oswald was at the Cuban embassy on one day only. 6. An interview with Deba Garro de Guerrero Galvan. 7. An interview with Eunice Odio. 9. An interview with Emilio Carballido. Footnote: Elena Garro reported that at one of the twist parties, Emilio Carballido and Eusebio Azcu had come to the conclusion that Kennedy had to be assassinated. See also Section 6C above. End footnote. And 10. An interview with Victor Rico Galan. Footnote: Elena Garro alleged that Victor Rico Galan had claimed that Lee Harvey Oswald had been Sylvia Duran's lover. See also Section 6C above. End footnote. The HSCA also asked to be shown the Cuban consulate. The Mexican representatives informed the HSCA staff that Victor Rico Galan had, at one time, been arrested on political charges, but that he was subsequently pardoned by either Diaz Ordaz or Luis Echeverria. The Mexicans said that they were searching for all files and newspaper articles requested by the HSCA. The Mexican officials also offered their observations orally on the preliminary interviews conducted the previous day. They pointed out that they found it strange that Sylvia had told Oswald he could not travel while in Cuba. They wondered what Duran was trying to tell Oswald, and whether she thought that Oswald had some objective in going to Cuba other than that ascribed by the popular version. They also considered the manner in which Sylvia obtained employment at the Cuban consulate unusual. Generally, they noted that Sylvia and her brothers seemed to have almost programmed responses and a defensive demeanor. They pointed out, however, that all the Durans had been very interested in talking to us. In their opinion, Ruben Duran was the most credible of those interviewed by the HSCA the previous day. At this point, a Mexican official who had been checking the computer records informed us that Victor Rico Galan had died. HSCA staff members provided the Mexican authorities with the names of the Mexican officials who had been involved in the investigation in 1963. HSCA staff members met again with the Mexican police authorities at 10 a.m. on June 2, 1978. At this time, the Mexican police provided the copies of the newspaper clippings on the assassination of John F. Kennedy from the Excelsior. HSCA staff members asked if the Mexicans could persuade the newspapers to reveal the sources of their stories about Oswald and Sylvia Duran. The Mexican officials' response was negative. The Mexican officials informed the HSCA staff members that most of the data we wanted from the files was in their security service files. The Mexican officials working with the HSCA explained that they were the Mexican equivalent of the FBI and that the security service was the Mexican equivalent of the CIA. Hence, there was the usual bureaucratic problem involved in obtaining access to the security services files. The Mexicans informed the HSCA representatives that Emilia Garbaído had been located, that Deba Garro could not be located, and that there was no record of anyone named Eunice Odio. HSCA representatives told the Mexican officials that Odio, who was either Costa Rican or Guatemalan, had been the mistress of Emilio Garbaído. The assassination and the reaction of the Mexican people to it was discussed. At 1 p.m., HSCA staff members conducted an interview at the United States Embassy in connection with the CIA aspects of the Mexico City investigation. At 2:30, Gary Cornwell discussed problems with the chief of the Mexico City CIA station. He requested that the COS cable headquarters regarding restrictions placed on the HSCA staff in Mexico. At 6 p.m., the HSCA staff members, accompanied by Jesus Machurio Canti and his assistant, Honorio Oscandan, met with the assistant chief of the Mexican Security Service, Nazar. Mr. Nazar gave an oral resume of the interviews which Mexican officials conducted in 1963 of Sylvia, Horacio, and Ruben Duran and Betty Serratos. Mr. Nazar said that the files had to be formally requested before he could consider releasing them. He suggested that we secure statements admissible in United States courts from the witnesses whom we wished to interview. Mr. Nazar suggested that our best investigatory avenue would be to concentrate on Oswald's interrogation after his arrest on November 22nd. Mr. Nazar had a very low opinion of Elena Garro de Paz's credibility. He felt that she confused fact and fiction. June 3rd and 4th, 1978, were spent on CIA-related aspects of the Mexico City investigation. 2 interviews were conducted. All interviews, with the exception of interviews with CIA personnel, were taped and later transcribed. At 11 a.m. on June 5, 1978, the HSCA staff interviewed Horacio Duran for the record. At 1 p.m., HSCA staff member Edwin Lopez and Mexican officials Honorio Oscandan and Dr. Alfonso Orozco Gutierrez interviewed Pedro Gutierrez Valencia for the record. At 5 p.m., HSCA staff members interviewed Lynn Duran, a.k.a. Lydia Duran, for the record. On June 6, 1978, at 11 a.m., the HSCA staff interviewed Ruben Duran for the record. At 1 p.m., the staff representatives met with Comandante Ventura. The staff representatives agreed to supply the Mexicans with questions for two witnesses, Oscar Contreras and Ernesto Lefeld Miller, who could not then be interviewed. Footnote: the committee never sent the Mexican government the questions because a second trip to Mexico was arranged. End footnote. Comandante Ventura authorized Honorio Escondon to interview Oscar Contreras Lartigue and Ernesto Lefeld Miller. At 5 p.m., the wife of Ruben Duran, Betty Serratos, was interviewed for the record. At 5:45 p.m., Sylvia Duran was interviewed for the record. The HSCA staff representatives left Mexico City at 8:30 a.m. on June 7, 1978, arriving in Washington, D.C. at 5:30 p.m. Washington time.